Hi, everyone. I'm Mischa Renfroe. I'm a professor of English at Middle Tennessee State University. And on behalf of the Society for the Study of Rebecca Harding Davis and her world, I'd like to welcome you to one of our panels for the virtual component of the American Literature Association's annual meeting. We're really pleased to offer three wonderful papers. I'm going to introduce all three speakers at once. Then each of them will give their papers, and we should have time for some question and answer at the end. So our first speaker will be Arielle Zibrak, who's an associate professor of English and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wyoming. Her essays have appeared or are forthcoming in American Literature, the Arizona Quarterly, Criticism, the Edith Wharton Review, ESQ, the LA Review of Books, and Women's Studies. She's also the editor of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, new centenary essays from Bloomsbury Press, and she recently completed Avidly Reads Guilty Pleasures with NYU Press. Our second speaker is also our panel organizer. Thanks to Aaron for that. Aaron Rovan is a doctoral candidate in the English department at West Virginia University. He's published articles on gender, street children, religious iconography, and modernist poetry. His research interests include folklore, vernacular religion, the role of American women writers in constructing definitions of American ethnicity. And in addition to teaching part-time at Central State University, he's currently an intern at the Smithsonian Center for Folklore and Cultural Heritage, where he works with the storytellers of the digital magazine Folklife. We also have Stephanie Vastein. She's a newly minted PhD from the University of North Texas, and her presentation today is a small portion of her doctoral dissertation, which used queer theory to explore the ways that American authors wrote about identity at the turn of the 20th century. Her research interests include race, gender, sexuality, and futurity. She plans to continue publishing and teaching in the future and is currently on the job market. So with those bios behind us, I'd like to thank all of you for participating, and I'll turn things over to our first speaker.
Is that me? Sorry, I wasn't sure which order we were going in. Thank you so much for that introduction, Mischa, and thank you to Aaron for organizing, to Robin and Stephanie for being here, and to anyone who is watching us. I'm really happy that we were able to get together and do this work and think together. So my paper today is titled Mimesis and the Man Marriage, Protesting Marital Rape in Rebecca Harding Davis's The Second Life. Who in Rebecca Harding Davis's 1863 story, The Second Life, gets to live twice? References to multiple lives forged through secrecy and the vicissitudes of fortune, such as those above, were common in the 19th century sensation romance. Primarily written by British authors, sensation fiction such as these were popular throughout the 1860s in both the UK and America. But The Second Life is an unusual work of sensation fiction from an unlikely source, a writer known for realistic stories of social protest. Furthermore, while it is typically the heroine's duplicity that allows her to live more than once in a sensation fiction, the second life of Rebecca Harding Davis's tale initially seems to refer to a rekindling of youthful romance. The story of a couple separated during their engagement, only to be reunited and finally married 40 years later. The Second Life concludes with the narrator and the male half of the star-crossed couple declaring, "Esther, Lashley, and I began our second life." Such capitalization certainly suggests a reference to the title, and therefore implies that the second life under consideration involves the marriage between the two protagonists. Yet a far more complex web of associations to the idea of a second life has occasioned a host of critical interpretations that read the story's title as an allegory of various splits in the author's life and career. Davis was both a homemaker and a successful professional author, a writer for profit and for prestige of both popular genre and literary fiction. In this talk, I will consider how these various divisions between political reform and popular entertainment, social and economic gain, realism and sensation, work together to create a protest of one of the most contentious issues of the day, marital rape, while simultaneously demonstrating how fiction might play a role in this pressing social problem. By addressing marital rape in her fiction, Davis inserts herself into the feminist debates of her own moment. Marital rape divided the American women's rights movement prior to the Civil War. In the postbellum period, suffrage eclipsed the subtler and arguably more radical issues that the protest of marital rape raised, such as the right to divorce, the existence of female sexual desire, and the ownership of one's body regardless of sex. Arguably, these conversations initiated a centuries-long discourse about consent. By calling her story The Second Life, Davis may indeed be referencing the plight of the mid-19th century woman who, like the passive and shadowy heroine of her story, must live as what Simone de Beauvoir much later called a secondary being, under a system of laws that render even the most basic rights to bodily safety secondary to the desires of the man whose life she may have been forced to share. Marriage was, for Davis, the best fate for a woman, but she did not take this stance unequivocally. Marriage, provided it be based on pure, strong affection, is better for a woman, even under the worst circumstances, than a single life under the best, she wrote in 1886. An editorial she wrote for Putnam's magazine in 1869, coyly titled Men's Rights and centered on the question of female suffrage, turns the suffrage question into a consideration of the marriage question. There she argues that the problem of compulsory marriage for women who can't work to support themselves is that the mandate to marry leads to ill-chosen matches. She writes, "If the husband does not come soon, the innocent dream of love and marriage begins to fade out. She feels herself the one too many at home and abroad, a mistake in life, the solitary one of God's creatures who has neither use nor tie and is in the world on sufferance. So she marries, if she can, anybody that she can. She has a vague feeling that she is guilty of legal prostitution. But it would be so sweet to have a place as other women, a home and a baby of one's own. So the bargain and sale goes on." The term legal prostitution appeared in Mary Wollstonecraft's foundational 1793 Vindication of the Rights of Women, and later became central to the arguments advanced by some of the feminists who convened in Seneca Falls in 1848 to sign the Declaration of Sentiments authored by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The first signer of the document was the organizer of the conference, Lucretia Mott, a woman whom Davis later met and deeply admired. Mott was mentor to Stanton, an activist whose views were often tempered by her more moderate and pragmatic colleague, Susan B. Anthony. Stanton's commitment to the questions about marriage and female sexuality raised in the conversation surrounding both women's rights and temperance in the antebellum period never flagged, even well past the movement's postbellum abandonment of these issues in order to focus almost exclusively on attaining the vote. Her attacks on marriage and especially marital rape continued. As Gerda Lerner writes, "It was Stanton who, in Spiritual Isolation, kept alive the radical critique of American society and of traditionalist sexual mores." Ellen Carroll Du Bois notes that Stanton returned her focus on temperance after Seneca Falls because the conversations surrounding temperance offered more opportunity to get at what Stanton understood to be the root of female oppression, the laws and conversations surrounding marriage. The slogan used by Stanton to draw out the feminist implications of marriage, Du Bois states, was legalized prostitution. Legalized prostitution was also a buzzword at an 1853 temperance convention in Rochester, New York, where, as Lisa Shawn Hogan notes, Stanton presented resolutions advocating liberal divorce laws, including the radical idea that no woman remain in relation of wife with the confirmed drunkard. In her 1853 speech, she went beyond the plight of the drunkard's wife to critique the sacredness of the marriage institution, concluding that any law or public sentiment that forces two immortal, highborn souls to live together as husband and wife, unless held there by love, is false to God and to humanity. Stanton called the terms of marriage as they existed the man marriage, emphasizing the brutality of many domestic circumstances for women, and specifically bringing attention to the marital rape epidemic. By the end of the 60s, Stanton had come to argue that society as organized today under the manpower is one grand rape of womanhood. Throughout the 1950s, Stanton's objections remained centered on the physical violence to which women could be subjected under the current system. In an 1860 address, she attempted to stir the fear of this violence most vividly, quoting, "Fathers, do you say, let your daughters pay a lifelong penalty for one unfortunate step? How could they, on the threshold of life, full of joy and hope, believing all things to be as they seemed on the surface, judge of the dark windings of the human soul? How could they foresee that the young man, today so noble, so generous, would in a few short years be transformed into a cowardly, mean tyrant, or a foul-mouthed, bloated drunkard? What father could rest at home by night, knowing that his lovely daughter was at the mercy of a strong man drunk with wine and passion, and that do what he might, he was backed up by law and public sentiment?" The repeated attacks many women were forced to face within the confines of marriage, attacks for which they had neither legal recourse nor means of escape, remained for Stanton the most pressing crisis for 19th century women, and one, I suggest, that Davis likewise tried to address through her fiction. The marriage of Esther Lashley, the heroine of Davis's The Second Life, is precisely a lifelong penalty for one unfortunate step, a penalty that the story initially seems to endorse rather than criticize. When The Second Life opens, the primary narrator and protagonist, John Lashley, is an old man looking back on events that transpired 40 years prior to his storytelling. The subject of his story is Esther Lashley, an orphaned cousin who was raised by the Lashley family. The Lashleys had 3 biological sons, Robert, John, and Clayton. John and Esther were close as children and became engaged to be married as young adults. John began building a cabin for them in the woods near the family home, but he left town to sell the crops before their wedding. As John tells it, the rest of the story is of a deed so foul, I think I will hurry over it. In John's absence, his mother, who is never mentioned by name, forces Esther to marry Clayton, her favorite son. At this point in the story, John, the narrator, has already revealed that Esther has been subjected to Clayton's sexual harassment and attacks. Quote, "When Esther Paul was a child, she was the victim of his petty, cruel spite. She grew into womanhood, became beautiful, they said. Then she became something else. He gave her something more terrible than hate." When he returns from his trip to find Esther and Clayton married, John flees to San Francisco with the goal of becoming a wealthy, lifelong bachelor. Esther remains in the cabin John built for them, now with her legal husband, Clayton. There she endures, according to Robert, torture by the foul beast who called her wife, and falls into a slow, morbid gloom akin to madness. She bears Clayton's son, whom she names Presley. 10 years after they marry, Clayton relocates the small family to Pennsylvania and subsequently disappears. Esther is accused of his murder, and though she is acquitted, even Robert believes her to be guilty. She spends the next 30 years in poverty, secretly following Presley wherever he goes to ensure his well-being. As Robert reveals, Presley told me of an old ragged woman who beset him in his walks to school and sometimes would kiss his hands, even his shoes. The apparent misogyny of the Second Life is difficult to account for, even for Davis. And across the board, the female characters in The Second Life push the limits of even the mild gendered stereotyping of Davis's other works. Clayton's intemperance, the result of his mother's pampering, is clearly at the root of his sexual violence toward Esther. Quote, "He forced his presence, his embraces on her, holding her with his pale, snaky eye, his whiskey-poisoned breath on her lips. And so, the end. As he ages, coarse hair like an animal's grows over his body, and he drives Esther mad with his incessant flute playing, details that align him with the satanic imagery of the Greek god Pan, who was often depicted in classical sculpture with a large erect penis and accompanied by his companion Dionysus, the god of wine. The implication of these details is that Esther is repeatedly raped within the marriage before running away to live in penury. When Esther is reunited with the Lashleys many years later, and Clayton is revealed to be alive, she decides to spend the rest of her life caring for him, despite some mild familial protestation, such as when John and Clayton's brother Robert announces, "She is saved. She has borne enough. So long as she lives, this house is her home. She shall never see the face of the man who has so wrecked her life again." But Esther insists that it is her duty that she care for her legal husband, Clayton, until the end. She did do it, went back, not to the old loathsome servitude, that could never be again, but watched, tended, nursed this man. It had been easier for her to have cared for the lowest beast that grovels in the mire. Esther is released from her marriage to Clayton only when he stabs himself to death, and the story concludes with Esther and John's wedding. Ultimately, Esther is celebrated for her endurance of the unthinkable trial of her first marriage, which is juxtaposed with the true second marriage she finally enters into with John. Like most sensation fictions, the second life is told multivocally, and almost all of its narrators are male. John Lashley, the primary narrator, a Kentucky lawyer named Donald, whom John meets on a steamer, Robert Lashley, Presley Lashley, and one female narrator who briefly appears as a witness in a trial. The plot is filtered through the misogynistic logic of these intradiegetic voices. As a female-authored story told almost entirely by unreliable male characters, the second life performs what Luce Irigaray calls mimesis, or strategic essentialism, a process whereby women recapitulate sexist views in order to interrogate them. For Irigaray, this process constitutes a dialectical answer to the binaristic problem of female engagement in hegemonic discourse. Either women adopt the rhetoric of their oppressors or exclude themselves from mainstream conversations. She writes, this is Irigaray, to play with mimesis is thus, for a woman, to try to recover the place of her exploitation by discourse, without allowing herself to be simply reduced to it. It means to make visible, by an effective playful repetition, what was supposed to remain invisible. In the second life, Davis ventriloquizes male voices through her narrators, illuminating the faulty logic upon which their views are predicated. In so doing, and by omitting any of Esther's perspective, male narrative dominance is aligned with the horror of silencing victims of marital rape. Davis's literary protest illuminates the connection between the sensation novel's popular romanticization of sexual violence for financial gain and the complicity towards such violence in the culture at large through the refusal to pass laws that allow women to prosecute or even divorce their rapists under the hegemonic social and economic dominance of what Stanton called the man marriage. The multivocality of the second life creates a kind of Greek chorus of oppressive social consensus, concretized in a legal code so thoroughly disadvantageous to women, it leaves her, quote, more weary, footsore with her pilgrimage than any male narrator could possibly conceive. When it was published in Peterson's, the second life was attributed to the author of The Murder of the Glen Ross, referencing Davis's popular story previously serialized in Peterson's, which uses a narrator she took up in several of her other stories as well, the male lawyer John Page. Like the narrators who populate the second life, Page is unreliable due to his own blind position of social advantage. He is a wealthy white slaveholder who tells a story that launches, as Sharon Harris has argued, a powerful social and legal critique. Davis's dramatic choice to use a slave-holding, unreliable, genteel Southern lawyer as her narrator was a notably risky one, but it becomes her most effective tool for damning the mask of gentility that harbors the horrors of slavery's injustice. In addition to connecting the two stories in attribution, Davis once again uses Irigarian mimesis to highlight the injustices of the marriage laws through a repetition of faulty male logic. According to Susan Kozel, the text becomes the villain, and the reading of it opens up the truth. In such mimetic texts, for Davis, the sensation tale has the potential to become, like the law, an inescapable cultural code whose conventions sanction moral wrongs. The portrait of marriage the second life offers is both rendered and celebrated by male characters who benefit from the institution as it stands. However, the man marriage they so unreliably describe is revealed to be a bitter trial for women. After disclosing the details of Clayton's sexual attacks upon Esther, John, the narrator, reflects, "It was a strange story, unreal, as I looked about the crowd of businessmen, the unpleasant-faced women, promenading the deck, at the heaps of barrels and boxes, the smoking, the newspapers, the joking. Why, a deed of crime and passion like this belonged only to the boards of a theater. What could these snug merchants or their dressy wives know of such passions?" John's narration continues in what seems to be a conversational style as he answers his own question. No, there was not one of them to whom these things were not real and commonplace. Every one of those newspapers held a dozen such histories. Here I argue Davis cannot resist taking over. The unreal melodrama is revealed to be a realist critique that takes us from the sensation of the theaters to the realism of the newspapers, pointing out that such strange stories written and printed for profit romanticize and thus obscure the real and commonplace violence to which women were routinely subjected in their homes. The disconnected relationship between the gendered representations within popular fiction and the trials suffered by countless women in real life was likewise a subject of the debates on temperance and the divorce laws themselves. In an appeal written in 1853, Stanton evokes the romantic chivalric tradition sarcastically, referencing knights and shields, to, like Davis, poke holes in inconsistent and oppressive male rhetoric. This is Stanton. As our chivalrous knight, we only ask that in your leisure hours you will duly consider the unjust laws that now disgrace your statute books, that you will unite with us against our national foe, intemperance, that you will lend us your influence to create a healthful public sentiment that shall deny to drunkards the rights of husbands and fathers, that shall give the drunkard wife her property without taxation and her children without fear of molestation. You would fain have women in the retirement of private life, then protect her in her home. You love to look upon her as a sacred being, then make her so in her holiest relations. We, the women of the 19th century, your mothers, wives, and sisters, ask you to throw around us a shield of defense against social tyranny and civil injustice, against a code of laws unworthy of Nero himself. So grievous are they in their bearing upon the poor and helpless of our sex. Alas, that such laws should now bear the sanctions of our husbands, sires, and sons. Alas, for this proud republic, if its women, the repository of all that is noble and virtuous in national character, can command no higher honors, no purer homage, no juster laws at your hands. Stanton's political words here are of a piece with Davis's fictional rhetoric. Their mimetic invocation of sexist logic makes a villain of the text, be it fiction or law, in order to make visible a more profound truth. So long as the lives of women come second to the desires of men, society as a whole will have a penalty to pay. Despite what John may think, Esther Lashley does not get to live two lives. Instead, she must live one long, torturous life as a secondary being. Unlike other sensation fictions that expose the dangerous reality of female desire for sex or money, the sensationalism of the second life obscures female desire altogether. In so doing, it calls attention to how the male logic under which the laws were written does not take into account the fact that women do desire to have the same rights to economic and bodily security granted their male counterparts. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So my presentation, I think that I made a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can get this shared. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. So my presentation today is Spiritualism, Christianity, and Economics in a Law Unto Herself. Let's see if we can do this. There we go. So for my presentation today, I am going to be talking about this novel, A Law Unto Herself. It was in 1878, published in 1878. And it's kind of a crazy novel. There's a lot of plot going on here. And so I'm going to skip over some of the tricky plot details, but the things that you kind of need to know about A Law Unto Herself are our main character is Jane Swenden. Her father is Captain Swenden. Her mother has deceased by the time the novel starts. Her name was Virginie. And Jane is caught up in this inheritance kind of scheme. Her grandfather, Virginie's dad, had removed the Swendens from his will because of a slight given by the captain to old Moreau. And so the novel kind of goes about, will Jane get the inheritance that really is morally due her, or will she not? And on top of that, there's a marriage plot. Will Jane marry the social reformer and all-around bad guy, Pliny Van Ness, or is she going to marry the journalist, overcome her aversion to him, and marry the good guy, Bruce Neckert? So within this story, there is sort of this undercurrent of religious language and religious themes that Davis likes to do in all of her writing, I think, but it struck me especially in A Law Unto Herself. And so my central question coming into this presentation was, how does religious language and religious themes kind of illuminate the economic and the legal questions that are at the heart of the novel? And so what I propose to do here is to actually look at 3 other stories that Davis wrote to kind of help shed some light on what's going on in the novel. And the 3 stories that I chose kind of represent the different kind of religious backgrounds that Davis explores in her novel. So American Convents was published in 1875, and it deals with Catholicism. The Captain's Story was an earlier story published in 1866, where she writes about spiritualism and mental telepathy. And then On Sunday Afternoon, published in 1882, focuses on kind of what I'm calling mainstream Protestantism, in kind of contrast to the other 2. So my thesis is that Davis advocates for a kind of vernacular religion, or I'm going to explain what that kind of means in a minute, but it's detached from the dictates of organized institutionalized religion, and it depicts religion as it is lived. So Davis promotes personal responsibility and the cultivation of individual morality to guide decisions in all of our aspects of life. So I use that term vernacular religion very purposely. Leonard Premiano defines it as religion as it is lived, as human beings encounter, understand, interpret, and practice it. So you can think of vernacular religion not as separate from institutionalized religion, not as separate from like Presbyterianism or Catholicism, but vernacular religion refers to kind of like an individual who kind of takes the teachings of a religion and then lives it out. They interpret it and then they sort of apply it to their own lives. And this is actually something that Davis did in her own life. I think we all do it. But so Sharon Harris, in her biography of Davis, tells this story about how Davis was kind of at odds with the church she was going to in Philadelphia. And so instead of going to church on some Sundays, she would find another activity to do, walking in the park with her husband, usually, and she would get spiritual nourishment from that. And so that's kind of like what I'm talking about with vernacular religion. It's sort of how you interpret those beliefs. So what I say is that her approach to religion is grounded in individual acts rather than through institutions. And like the theory of vernacular religion, which calls attention to the ways in which individuals use religious practices to guide their own individual actions, Davis highlights how religious adherents may act in ways that contradict their religion's set beliefs when their individual kind of conscience calls them to do so. So I'm going to start by talking about the Catholicism in the novel, because it's sort of where the novel starts. So those 2 main characters, Jane Swenden and Captain Swenden, kind of to me represent the more Protestant kind of background in the story. And old Moreau, who would be Jane's maternal grandfather, is kind of like the Catholic. He was from New Orleans, which in the 1870s usually always meant Catholic, and they were wealthy. The Swendens, on the other hand, were from Sweden, and even though they were royalty, they have been poor for centuries. So in the story, they're one of the original settlers of Pennsylvania, but they just don't have the economic security that someone like Moreau in Catholic New Orleans has. And so there's kind of this linking in the story between the religious aspect of their backgrounds and the economic. And so I think that comes, it's really interesting that those economic concerns in a religiously mixed relationship kind of help Davis to articulate the tension between heritage economics and religious traditions. And I think that she does this to foreground the tensions that are inherent even in a shared Christian faith tradition. So both Virginie and Captain Swenden were Christian, but they approach it from very different aspects. So to kind of illuminate Davis's feelings on Catholicism, I look to a couple things that she wrote prior to A Law Unto Herself. In an 1870 letter to Annie Fields, Davis talks about writing a story about the Catholic Church, and she says that she feels cowardly because she says the Catholic system is such a male-proof coat of armor. And it actually, hearing Arielle's presentation, kind of reminded me of this quote too, where Arielle was talking about the armor of male rhetoric. I think that is something that kind of colors Davis's view of the Catholic Church too. In 1875, she published, even though she was feeling cowardly in 1870, in 1875, she published American Convents, which is sort of supposed to be taken as an expose of Catholicism and specifically nuns and convents. It tells this story about a girl who was taken in by a convent, doesn't like it there, and eventually escapes. On the night before she's supposed to take her vows, she escapes, and she lives kind of this life outside the convent for a while. And then it's suggested in the story that she gets kidnapped by the nuns, I guess, and they take her back to the convent. So it's sort of this kind of wild tale. And I pulled a quote from it because I think that this kind of is the main point I'm trying to get to. And she says, Davis writes, "I've given more time than I ought to this story. Simply, I am afraid because it interested me and is true. It has really very little bearing on the subject. It does not at all matter whether such outrages or any outrages are practiced in convents. The point is that outrages should be made impossible, that the barred sister houses and nunneries, as well as the barred jails and insane asylums, should be open to regular, legalized examination and their immured inmates given the chance of complaint, as well as the madman or felon." So yeah, that's some pretty strong language about convents on the same level as jails and insane asylums. So when we apply that idea to A Law Unto Herself, that kind of gives us some context of how Davis could be approaching Catholicism. And the portrait of old Moreau is not very kindly. Davis does not kind of picture him very well. Oh, and this is just, I wish I could have expanded this, but this is a Harper's Weekly published in 1876, I believe. So a few years before A Law Unto Herself came out, kind of depicting, so the guy's a teacher and he's telling the nun to go away. And the details on this are amazing. So if you can just Google Thomas Nast and nuns, you'll be able to kind of pull this up a little bit better and see all the writing on it. It's pretty neat. So there's Catholicism, and then there is spiritualism. So the first several chapters of A Law Unto Herself deals with this spiritualist seance, and it's kind of where we get all the backstory. And so Davis herself really was not a fan of spiritualism, even though by the time she was writing A Law Unto Herself, it had kind of spiritualism sort of had its heyday, and it had its own adherents, literary adherents like Harriet Beecher Stowe. But by the time she's writing in 1878, spiritualism is kind of on the wane. In 1866, though, she wrote The Captain's Story, which deals very much with spiritualism. And in that story, a ship's captain is on the lookout for his ship hand Wiley because he disappeared. And so the ship's captain just happens to meet 3 mediums on his road to find Wiley, and they each have their own their own idea of what happened to the ship hand. One says he's alive on a whaling boat. One says that he's definitely been murdered and so is dead. And one says that he ran away to repay debts. And so these 3 mediums kind of give us vastly different portraits of what happened to Wiley and where he went. And throughout the story, the captain is insistent that spiritualism is just a fake. It's a fraud. And he says that he's determined to look through the absurdity and mystery of this so-called spiritualism until he has discovered the truth, which for him is mental telepathy, which is the idea, of course, that you can just read a person's mind and then it transfers into your own mind. And so the captain concludes that in this case, as in every other of which I have become cognizant, the mediums have only put into shape the thoughts of those who question them. To admit that certain persons can at will become possessed of the secret movements in the mind of another will solve the whole mystery. So, so in Davis's story, in this earlier story, she characterizes spiritualism as kind of a confidence scheme. Rather than communicating with the dead, the mediums kind of play off of your confidence that you put in them, and they just repeat it back to you. So it depends on the confidence that you have in those individuals. And that kind of plays out in A Law Unto Herself. So in the seance scene, the seance has been called in order to talk to Virginie to see what she wants done with the money. And so that's kind of the whole point for this seance, to see what she wants the inheritance to do. And at the moment that Virginie supposedly materializes, Jane, who is Virginie's daughter, of course, throws the curtains aside and lets the light stream in, and in doing so reveals that the ghost is actually the medium, Mrs. Combe. And so there's kind of layers of fraud here, because Mrs. Combe is just using kind of this medium in order to enrich herself. She takes the money, pretends to be the person that they want them to be, and then kind of gets rich off of their religious belief, which is why I think Davis is so critical of spiritualism, because even though it's kind of like that vernacular religion, that kind of like interpreting beliefs for yourself, Davis seems to reject the idea of enriching yourself from it. So the last story I want to talk about deals with what I'm calling mainstream Protestantism, because Davis, the stories that I found sometimes don't identify the specific Protestant tradition that she's talking about. And so so it's important kind of to realize that she doesn't fully reject the teachings of organized Christianity in all of her writings. What she does, though, is value the informal the informal communications that structure a person's belief system. So on Sunday Afternoon is a story written in 1882 after A Law Unto Herself, in which the narrator recounts a pastor's sermon, and she says that it was a shrill note of alarm sent into the midst of our pleasant church-going respectable life. So she's not really a big fan of this pastor's sermon. But throughout the story, the narrator interacts with people that reflect the pastor's sermon. And so there are 2 kind of lived examples of what happens, of what the pastor's talking about. There's an Irish immigrant mother who scrimped by in order for her twin daughters to kind of like dress in the modern way. So this Irish immigrant really sacrificed herself in order to basically look richer than she would have otherwise. And secondly, an old woman who had once been wealthy but hides now in her old age, and she's pure. And both of these examples illustrate the pastor's sermon about the dangers of modern life, to put on modern riches only for the purpose of keeping up appearances. That's what the sermon was about, and that's what these two lived experiences are about. And the narrator sort of realizes throughout the day and through the gossip that she's hearing about these people that there's only so much that a fiery sermon can do, and that you kind of need to live these experiences and see them working in the world to appreciate the message. So within A Law Unto Herself, I think that Davis kind of foregrounds this idea of individual conscience and personalized charity. So those personal actions that one takes to kind of better society. And sort of towards the end of the novel, when Jane finally does get the inheritance and she buys a farm, and she takes some poor people from Philadelphia, she takes them to the farm with her and gives them what she thinks is a good life. And some of the other characters start to question whether Jane should be doing this, whether the people actually appreciate Jane kind of taking them into her household and away from everything they knew in the city. Cornelia, one of the other characters, for example, says that very young girls are apt to be impetuous in their charities and damage more than they help. And so Jane sort of ruminates on this and eventually comes to the conclusion that she's actually doing right. And something that Robin Cadwallader writes kind of sheds light on this, that Davis advises a return to charity, to kindness performed for love's or Christ's sake, with a personal knowledge of and responsibility for the poor and needy. So in this sense, Jane is following that kind of individual lived experience religion. And Jane, more than any other character, displays a behavior that is closer to Christ's model of kind of benevolence for the poor, more than any of the other characters do who are sermonizing her. So this is where I'm going to end. One of the kind of things that gets said about Davis is that one of her core projects was to present brotherly love that spread throughout American culture. And if that's true, as Janice Milner Lassiter suggests, then the Swendens are definitely a core part of that project of spreading brotherly love. Not only is their name linked to a royal heritage of brotherly love through their settling of Philadelphia, but that brotherly love comes with no economic benefit. And so for Davis, it seems that brotherly love equates not to hoarding your wealth or to putting on the trappings of modern society, but to altruistic individual actions that make the world just a little bit of a better place. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks again for organizing this whole panel. I'm very excited to talk about Davis. So in her 1906 essay, Women as Imitators of Men, Rebecca Harding Davis underscored her belief in the power of women to challenge the authority usually ascribed to men, and marks this as a sign of the times at the turn of the 20th century. She writes, quote, "In previous times, the older woman regarded herself simply as part of the human race. The man was its head, its spokesman. She thought of herself as his child, his wife, or his mother. The woman of today is not only his equal, but his antagonist. She talks not of humanity, but of womanity, end quote. In the novel I will be discussing today, Frances Waldow, Davis represents the ultimate female antagonist, the dangerous and even murderous woman with financial power who will stop at nothing to ensure the success and futurity of her family. Davis's belief in the shift to womanity is evidenced by the power of strong and assertive female characters, even if it drives them to the edge of insanity. Before beginning, it's kind of important to note that in the longer articulation of this argument, I'm reading the parent-child relationship as a metaphor for the relationship between the state and citizens, so that the idea of futurity is also taking on more national identity implications. However, in this presentation, I will outline the ways in which Davis depicts this subversive feminine power through the character of Frances Waldow. I also argue that this novel queers the narrative expectations surrounding the marriage plot and reveals the complexities of motherhood at the turn of the 20th century. My ultimate goal is to reclaim Davis's final novel, Frances Waldow, as an important commentary on the American family and women's mental and spiritual health. Davis's characterization of Frances pushes the psychological implications of motherhood to dark places that are extremely queer in their larger literary significance. As I argue in my dissertation, to queer a literary narrative is to change the context, assumptions, and implications of otherwise predictable and binary scripts. The fact that realist authors like Davis began to depict alternative modes of family formation, ones that were messy, violent, and far from idyllic, show the queer undercurrent that begins to challenge the fulfillment assured by heteronormative scripts of marriage and futurity. By queering the narrative expectations of the marriage plots at the turn of the 20th century, Davis reveals the dangers in adhering blindly to normative social scripts and suggests that true self-realization comes when characters direct their own futurity by whatever means necessary. Davis's final novel, Frances Waldow, was originally published in 1897. This novel has received virtually no scholarly attention in recent years, something I hope to change. As Sharon M. Harris points out in Rebecca Harding Davis and American Realism, we all mentioned Harris, I noticed, Davis's fiction is notable for its early articulation of realism as well as its foreshadowing of modernism in the 20th century. In the movement from Romanticism to realism, as well as that from realism to modernism, Davis was able to combine elements of genre conventions and to write alternatives that signal a queer orientation of her writing in their subversion of textual norms. So, some quick plot summary for context. Frances Waldow revolves around the experiences of an American mother and son, Frances and George, who travel together from America to Europe. While on the boat, George meets a mysterious French woman named Lisa Arpent, who is working as a maid to another family aboard the ship. Frances dislikes Lisa, who she views as untrustworthy. But of course, George and Lisa fall in love almost instantly and are quickly married shortly after their arrival. George then abandons his mother for most of the novel, sending Frances into a spiraling depression and loss of identity. After learning that Lisa has given birth to her grandson, Frances resolves to murder her. Early on in the novel, we learn that Frances and George have an unusually close parent-child bond. Frances thinks of George mainly as an extension of herself and intrinsically linked to her. Frances says to George, quote, "I never think of you as my son or a man or anything outside of me. Not at all. You're just me doing the things I should have done if I had not been a woman." Here, we see Frances's frustration with gendered expectations of her as a woman. Frances embraces the idea that her son is a literal extension of her own body and she assumes that this means she can anticipate George's actions, desires, and choices. At this point, Frances's identity is closely intertwined with that of her son. Her futurity is invested in the privileged and masculine identity that George embodies. Another important theme introduced in the first scenes of the novel that Aaron was actually just set me up very nicely for is that of faith and adherence to religious customs. Rather than a deeply held personal belief, religion for Frances in the novel is simply a means to an end, a marker of social and moral status. While she has always planned for George to become a clergyman, Frances acknowledges that she had never taken religion seriously. Quote, "It was like her gowns or her education, a matter of course, a trustworthy, agreeable part of her. She had never once in her life shuddered at a glimpse of any vice in herself or cried to God in agony even to grant her a wish." End quote. This suggests Davis's critique of the leisure class of the turn of the century and how the appearances of wealth and piety are more of a marker of social status than a deeply held conviction. The actions of the novel, however, create a huge shift in Frances's spiritual belief. As a single parent, Frances has also worked to assure her son's financial futurity, though she raises George to believe that they live on a large inheritance from his father. Frances has constructed this financial lie for George's benefit to save the reputation of his deceased father. In reality, Frances describes Colonel Waldow as, quote, "a drunken spendthrift who had left nothing. The house and farm always had belonged to his wife. She had invested her earnings shrewdly." End quote. George is completely unaware of his mother's employment and financial support. This speaks to the gendered roles of the time in that being supported financially by a woman would imply that George has failed somehow to successfully embody his masculinity in terms of economic security. Instead, women like Frances must work in the same sphere as men and compete for resources while remaining outwardly in their proper domestic roles. From her work to her leisure activities, Frances's identity at the beginning of the novel is devoted entirely to her son and his future, with little regard for her own desires. Her drive for futurity is invested in her role as a mother and not in her individual personality as a woman. Considering that Frances's own sense of identity is rooted in her class status and her relationship with her son, it's not surprising that class also colors her opinions of other women who are less fortunate. While still on the boat in the first scenes of the novel, Frances discusses such a woman, Pauline Felix, who was engaged in a scandalous affair and subsequently died. Frances makes it clear that she sees this affair as a personal failing of the woman attributable to genetics and lower class status, saying, quote, "Women of our class are in no more danger of temptation to commit great crimes than they are of finding tigers in their drawing rooms. Pauline Felix was born vicious. No woman could fall as she did who was not rotten to the core." End quote. This fallen woman trope makes it clear that Frances imagines herself as being immune from sin and temptation, and that these flaws are attributable to a corrupt character. Little does Frances know, Pauline Felix, the woman she was just referring to, is actually the mother of Lisa, who overhears this comment by Frances. This early observation about class and temptation begins the central conflict and triangulation between the mother and the future wife of George in the novel. However, as the action of the story moves forward, Frances's beliefs surrounding temptation are directly challenged. After arriving in Europe, George and Lisa are secretly married without Frances's knowledge or approval. When he tells his mother he has married Lisa, Frances becomes extremely confused and depressed, interpreting the sudden cleavage in the relationship with her son as a personal rejection. Since her foundational identity has been based on this relationship for so long, it is at this point that Frances's queer re-signification of her own identity begins. Frances's transformation over the course of the novel is depicted through a series of confrontations with her psychological self. One scene in particular provides some important symbolic markers for Frances's moral change. After learning that George and Lisa have had a son, Frances travels to find them. When she arrives, she takes an opportunity to sneak into Lisa's room and poison her drink in order to kill her. It's notable that for the majority of the novel before this, Frances shows no signs of murderous intent and is generally sympathetic to the reader. However, when she learns that George's progeny and therefore her family's futurity has been secured through the birth of her grandson, Lisa is the only obstacle that remains. For Frances, her descent into a murderous rage toward Lisa represents a shift in her character to an act of violence that at the beginning of the novel, she writes off as being a sign of moral deficiency. This moment challenges the trope of the passionate yet harmless maternal figure and recasts Frances as a more directly violent threat. Frances assumes that she has successfully killed Lisa by poisoning her, and this pushes her psychologically to a breaking point. After this attempted murder, Frances travels to Gaver Innis, a mysterious island with an ancient tomb. This is actually a real place. You can Google it. It's really interesting to see the images. Her guide describes Gaver Innis to Frances as follows, quote, "When there was not a man in the world, evil spirits built there an altar for the worship of the devil. It is the one place in the world, people say, where God has never been. A dreadful place," end quote. This godless island, Frances decides, is the perfect setting to meditate on the murder she believes she has just committed. She arrives at the island and enters the tomb-like structure, which is described as, quote, "a dark cave about 40 feet long, which was wholly lined with huge flat rocks, carved with countless writhing serpents. As Frances passed, they seemed to stir and breathe beside her, at her feet, overhead. The cave opened into a sacrificial chamber. The reptiles grew gigantic here and crowded closer. Through some rift, a beam of melancholy light crept in. A smell of death hung in the thick, unclean air," end quote. This description shows how Davis combines feminine and masculine imagery of reproduction and sexuality. The cave mirrors a womb with writhing serpents that increase as they move closer to the interior, like sperm. These reproductive symbols are contrasted with the, quote, "smell of death" in the interior chamber, which instead of being the place for the genesis of life, represents the place where lives were sacrificed. These symbols contrast the traditional life-giving aspects of maternity with the sinful reality of death, sacrifice, and evil intention. The cave is therefore a physical representation of Frances's conflicting internal identities of mother, monster, and murderer. When Frances emerges from the cave, she should be at her lowest point yet. However, she seems to reluctantly accept the death of her prospective future. She says, quote, "I never shall see George again. He will think of me only as the woman who has killed his wife." This moment is important in that for the first time, Frances is separating her identity from her role as a mother. In a sense, the murder she believes she has committed liberates her from the maternal identity she has embodied for most of the novel. It is at this moment that Frances experiences a kind of divine intervention and feels the presence of a force that she assumes is God. However, given the characterization of Gaver Innis as a place of devil worship and sacrifice, this could also easily be read as a meeting with the devil, bringing Frances's corruption full circle. The idea of finding God in a godless place is a common literary trope, but for Frances, the imagery of a dead womb and emerging out of the darkness of the cave signals her coming to terms with the death of her identity as a mother and a new hope for her future self. This transformation for Frances is a spiritual experience. By embracing the dark erotic violence of her innermost self, Frances is able to come to terms with her own fallibility. This reveals the dark and unacknowledged depths within women that exist when the surfaces of social expectations are removed. The corruption and subsequent salvation of Frances queers many normative associations between women and their natural roles as nurturing mothers. Frances, on the other hand, embraces her corruptibility. While she is not fully independent and her choices are still inspired mainly by a concern for her son and the family's future, she chooses to take on a violent and murderous identity, only to wonder at the spiritual implications this has for her soul and her place in the world. This scene shows a dramatic transformation in Frances's identity from the beginning of the novel, when she declared again that, quote, women of our class are in no more danger of temptation to commit great crimes than they are of finding tigers in their drawing rooms. Now she has committed arguably the worst crime, the attempted murder of a family member. By coming into direct confrontation with this dark and violent side of her personality, Frances is liberated momentarily from the boundaries of her previously assumed maternal identity. The marriage plot is ultimately queered by Frances's rejection of the selflessness and sacrifice traditionally associated with motherhood, and even gives the notion of maternal sacrifice much darker implications. However, this moment of acceptance doesn't last long, because George and Lisa happen to arrive on the island at exactly this moment. Frances, who thought she had killed Lisa, is overcome with emotion, but somewhat disappointed that Lisa is still alive. Shortly after they are reunited, Lisa confides in Frances that she is sick and will likely die soon, an illness seemingly unconnected with the poisoning. For Frances, who was previously coming to terms with the idea that she had killed Lisa, the news of her daughter-in-law's impending death comes as a relief. Though her character may be redeemed slightly by not actually having committed murder, Frances is still impacted by her spiritual experience in the sacrificial cave on the island. Frances thinks to herself that, quote, Lisa was blocking George's life, ruining his life, and God was taking her away so that she could no longer harm him. Lisa's impending death is, for Frances, confirmation of the spiritual experience she had on Gaver Innis, an answer to her darkest maternal prayers. Her faith is confirmed by Lisa's impending elimination. In the next scene, Lisa is dead, and Frances and George return to the United States together with her grandson, setting up the novel for a seemingly happy ending born out of the mother's murderous intentions. And I'm going to kind of stop the plot summary there, because I really hope some of you will actually read the novel, and I don't want to spoil it. So in conclusion, Frances Waldow uncovers the capacity of women to become the ultimate antagonists. This effectively queers the traditional role of mothers as protective and benevolent. This subversion speaks to Davis's nuanced articulation of the contradictory and complicated nature of motherhood and family formation. In the larger context of American imperialism that was achieved at the turn of the century, Frances Waldow highlights the violence and force with which American identity was being projected into the future. Beginning in the 19th century, conservative narratives surrounding marriage and family formation worked to police the reproduction of women. The more traditional marriage plots of the 19th century often had happy endings with content and financially secure families headed by strong men. However, authors such as Davis began to queer this narrative convention, effectively exposing the ways in which reproductive futurity, and by extension, national futurity, was being consolidated not by choice, but by the manipulation and force of complex women like Frances Waldow. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, you all. Thank you so much for those wonderful papers. I'll open things up now for question and answer from the people who were able to attend. And I guess another option, since this will be posted at some point on ALA's website, is perhaps if people listen to the recording later, they could reach out to individual presenters with questions or comments, because these are just really fascinating essays. Any questions for now?
Okay, I have a question for Aaron, because he knew I was gonna, I can't help myself. So, Aaron, I have read a lot on Martha Finley's Elsie Dinsmore as anti-Catholic literature, and that seems to be a real trend in the 19th century, 1830s. A lot of writers were getting into trouble for writing anti-Catholic literature, but by the 1870s, it seemed to have become a pretty popular way to get published. There was some, I think because of immigration, there was some huge fear about Catholics and Catholicism. So I'm wondering does Davis fit into this anti-Catholic phenomena among writers, or is she just like, this is a one-time thing with her? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that she fits into that kind of larger trajectory. So there was, in the really from like the 1840s to the 1890s, there was this fad of convent narratives that, so if you're not familiar with it, it's these stories that, so basically like the American convent that I talked about, someone gets abducted and they are like stuck in this jail of a convent, and there's like rape that happens there and all kinds of other abuses, and these are often framed as kind of like escape narratives, and so they're told after the fact by the people who escape. So I do think that what she's writing, it sort of fits into that kind of thing. Her later writing, it's really interesting, and I didn't get to talk about it in my presentation, but maybe 1890s or so, she published a series in the Congregationalist magazine about Dmitry Golitsyn, who was a priest from Russia who settled in like the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, and it was like she fell in love with him. So I think that there was some change there towards the end of her career, like, but in the time that she's writing, the law unto herself and those kinds of things, yeah, I think that she sort of does fit into that anti-Catholic.
Or at least is playing to an audience that expects that kind of writing, I would guess. And I always, I guess I just find it interesting because her father, coming from Ireland and, the whole Catholic Protestant conflict in Ireland, where that positioned her with religion. And I think she was always ambivalent about religion, but she did form her own. I always appreciate the way you said that lived kind of religion was what she embraced. Thank you.
I have a similar kind of question for Erin. Sorry to keep putting you on the spot, Erin, but wonderful papers, both of you. I'm curious about like this concept of vernacular religion, and if you identify, as Robin has said, I think it's really accurate in terms of like what Davis believed and how that comes through in her writings. But I'm wondering if you see that as a kind of idiosyncratic religious stance, or if vernacular religion can be understood as a broad cultural practice. And then if you do see it as a broad cultural practice, like how can we think about an individualistic religious orientation as a cultural practice? And also, are there other writers that you see sort of sympathetic to that ideological standpoint?
Yeah, thank you, Arielle. That's a great question. So I do think that it's sort of this broad cultural practice that you're talking about. I think that really, in my opinion, all religion is vernacular religion. It's just the way that we live our lives. If you belong to, no matter what kind of sect you belong to or what kind of institution you belong to, you're still going to interpret that religion in a certain way. And so in some ways, I think that you can apply that to all kinds of writers who bring religious themes into their writing. I'm trying to think of anyone in particular that might be interesting, and my mind is drawing a blank, but who does it really well is Kate Chopin. Yeah, she's writing about New Orleans, and a lot of that kind of like lived religion and lived Catholicism especially kind of makes her way into her writing. So thank you for that question.
I was going to suggest Kate Chopin, actually. I think that seems really right. And it's also a really interesting pairing because, of course, she comes from such a Catholic background and environment, but writes so interestingly about the conflicts there. So I mean, that's a great suite of issues to be investigating.
Thank you.
And this is a question, Erin, but just this part of the conversation also reminded me of, I think, one of your papers, or maybe a conversation about Wilson's sister, St. Luke. Like it seems like some of her work would fit into this conversation too, just to give you ideas for your next essay.
I find it kind of interesting, Erin, too, that Wilson, Davis, peripherally, I mean, we consider her, West Virginia Southern writer. I don't, but she writes a lot about the South. Martha Finley, Maryland, they're all writing about this Protestant fear. I mean, in Finley, it is, she actually tells, or the aunt tells little Elsie, the Catholics are going to eat you, so there's this huge, it seems to be more apparent in Southern writers too than maybe the Northern right. I don't know what's going on there. I just wanted to kind of, when Mischa said Wilson, I'm like, oh wait, South, right? So what's going on there with Southern writers? You would think anti-Catholicism would be more, if it's immigration based, would be more in the North where they were going into the mills and things like that. But here you have it more in the South. Just something to think about, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the one thing I would add is to keep in mind where they're being published. And so like I know for Wolfson, she was publishing, even though she was living in the South and writing about the South, she was publishing in Northern magazines. And so she was still trying to, much like Davis, appeal to those readers. And I think that sometimes that's what those Northern readers kind of expected and wanted. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting.
Yeah. I was actually wondering if Stephanie could talk more about religion. We're just going to keep on the religion train. Because I know that you had said you found Frances as non-religious, or something like that. So I was wondering if you could just talk more about kind of how you see Frances and like that whole, because she does things that are not moral, but she gets satisfaction out of them. So yeah, I was just wondering, I don't really have a question here, but maybe just something to talk about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really enjoyed both of your papers as well, because I feel like I was picking up on like new terms that I can go and like use when I try to expand this as well. Yeah, but Frances Waldow is really fascinating because, she starts out with this attitude of superiority, and then quickly devolves into this like dark, sinful place. But the moment where she's kind of, I don't know, she thinks that her experience, it's like God is answering her prayers by killing someone. It's like this strange version of what you were referring to as like the religion as it is lived, right? Because it's like the one time that she calls out to God, it's to grant like this dark prayer. And then when it happens, she takes this as like a confirmation of her faith, right? That at the beginning she doesn't really have. So it is a very interesting, dark kind of capitulation of that more normal narrative script. Yeah, kind of a reversed faith.
And I think I just wanted to add on here too. I think it also shows Davis's distrust of organized religion.
Yeah.
That she really was very critical of organized religion and how it was practiced. And I think that novel is particularly clear on that. And also A Law Unto Herself with the whole seance and stuff like that. She's really showing that organized religion is a sham, and she had to find a different way for herself. I just think that's so good of a connection between your two papers there. And Arielle, I just wanted to say the whole man marriage thing just always makes me laugh, right? Because I had never heard that term before. I don't know how I missed it, but somehow I never read it. And when you were talking about that, I don't know, it just always strikes me as funny because I'm like, a what? A man marriage? Like you just don't even think about it. But I just think there's a lot of weight in that term, isn't there? It's just so weighted somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I think Davis, as always, is a really complicated and interesting figure to explore political issues through, because on the one hand, I do think she's sympathetic to Stanton's notion that marriage as it exists in her period is organized specifically for the benefit of men. But on the other hand, she's as I think my paper showed, but also Stephanie's paper showed, she's a sort of staunch advocate of marriage as well. So like her ability to both champion marriage as an institution that serves as a really important means of social organization, but also to write really sort of almost vicious critiques of marriage, and particularly the laws surrounding marriage, is a really interesting one. And I do see her as very aligned with Stanton, because Stanton never went so far as to condemn marriage. She never joined the free love movement. She, by all accounts, was very happily married herself, as was Davis. And I think that in some respects, they saw their own marriages as a model for what marriage might be, but also recognized the fact that they were just fortunate and the laws were against women more generally. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting, I think this moment of feminism before suffrage took over is a really interesting moment to look at too, because not only did the suffrage question sort of create the racist turn that, resulted in the movement that we now think about as white feminism, but also the suffrage turn, I think, foreclosed a lot of these really, in some ways, more interesting debates about bodily autonomy and about rethinking marriage as an institution and a structure, which never really happened. So because suffrage took primacy in the women's movement after the war, I think that a lot of these interesting questions about how can we reorganize marriage laws and reorganize the marriage relationship never really got fully explored or answered.
Yeah, that's really good. I just wanted to add on to that. I'm sorry, Stephanie.
Oh, no.
The whole idea of choice in women being allowed to choose their partner, right? I think was so important to Davis. I don't know about Stanton so much, but so important to Davis in that, she was 30 when she married Clark. She made a choice, right? And that in most of her stories, when the woman gets to make the choice of who to marry, it turns out good. But when the woman does not get choice, when she's forced into a marriage that's not the right one, it never works out. So I think choice was always a really big issue. And you're right, these discussions didn't happen because other things superseded them. Stephanie.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add on, Arielle, I really appreciated your term, like you were saying about the multivocal narration, right? And this way that Davis is able to kind of articulate the rhetoric of the oppressor in order to then kind of critique that. And I thought that was just a really interesting connection that I saw kind of with all of our papers. It's almost as though Davis was especially attuned to these like institutional structures that are reinforcing these like patriarchal, right? Whether it's like laws, temperance, right, which the suffrage movement was very geared towards, like legal articulations of things. And then, you know, Aaron with obviously organized religion, like the strictness and the structures that are kind of underpinning that. I feel like she was so ahead of her time in seeing all of those as interconnected. I mean, even with life in the iron mills, right? We have this like the institutionalized class structure. So it's almost like she was seeing this pattern in all these different like intersectional aspects of identity, and all of her works seem to be different, right? Like critiquing different aspects of that. But it's just, I don't know, it's just one of the things that I really love about Davis. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would add to that I see her, I mean, a lot of these critiques are aligned along the axis of her distrust of money making. I don't want to say capitalism, but I think like maybe mercantilism or profiteering, in that, like, as Aaron's paper showed, a lot of her critique of organized religion or even kinds of vernacular religion like spiritualism was along the lines of thinking that people were using it for profit rather than actual spiritual gain. And I think the same was true of her stance towards social reform. I think she was deeply skeptical. I mean, I've always thought that it was really interesting that in A Law Unto Herself, the villain is a social reformer. And part of the problem is that he's a social reformer for profit, which was a tendency that she saw in a lot of her peers and especially in a lot of writers. And I think that part of what she objected to in both like political institutions and religious institutions was the way in which writers used their affiliations with those institutions as a means of profiting from their work or popularizing their work, as opposed to having, you know, what I think Aaron really clarified for us, like a real moral value outside that is like earned, like spiritually earned or morally earned, rather than just attaching oneself to an institution as a way of reaching a broader audience or profiting.
So I think I'm going to stop recording because we've hit the time limit that the ALA wants, but we can still talk. So I guess just thank you for tuning in, anyone on YouTube. And please let us know if you have questions. Okay, thanks.